On Christmas Day 2017, a quiet Phoenix neighborhood became the scene of a devastating family tragedy. What began as a routine welfare check led officers into one of Arizona's most unsettling holiday crimes, exposing the final hours of a fractured home and the choices that turned a day of celebration into loss. Christmas morning in Phoenix began like most holidays in the neighborhood. Lawns were quiet, driveways were still, and the streets carried that familiar calm that settles in when families gather indoors. It was the kind of morning where nothing looked out of place. Yet behind one apartment door, tension had been building long before sunrise. This was the home of 38-year-old Anthony Milan Ross and his estranged wife, 38-year-old Iris Ross, who had been trying to rebuild her life after the separation. To the outside world, nothing seemed immediately alarming, but inside that home was a history of strain, conflict, and emotional distance that had only grown worse over time. Ross had once built a public image around health, motivation, and personal change. He had been featured in lifestyle articles and documentaries, presenting himself as a man devoted to self-improvement. But the picture inside his marriage was far different. Friends later recalled how the relationship had become fragile. Arguments grew more frequent, money created strain, and Iris was working to establish independence. She had described wanting stability for their children, 11-year-old Nigel and 10-month-old Honora. The separation had not eased the tension. Instead, it seemed to push Ross deeper into resentment and control. That morning, neighbors didn't hear raised voices or signs of conflict. The first sign that something was wrong came from a message Iris had sent earlier, telling a friend she planned to meet Ross briefly, then return. The conversation sounded routine. She didn't express fear. She didn't indicate she expected trouble. The plan was simple. Hand off the children, handle the practical details many separated parents deal with, and get back home. By early afternoon, a friend grew worried. Iris had stopped responding. She had not returned home, and several messages went unanswered. The silence felt unusual, even out of character. As the day went on, concern turned to alarm. The friend drove to the apartment complex to check on her. What she saw immediately felt wrong. Iris's car was still there. No one came to the door. The atmosphere didn't match a family celebrating Christmas. After repeated attempts to reach her, the friend contacted police. Officers arrived to conduct a welfare check, expecting to find a routine misunderstanding or someone simply away from their phone. Instead, they quickly realized they were dealing with something far more serious. The front door showed signs of damage, and the apartment was unnervingly still. When officers made entry, they found Iris outside near the parking area, unresponsive, with injuries that left no doubt she had been attacked. What had begun as a welfare check now shifted into an unfolding homicide case. Police immediately looked for Ross and the children. There was no sign of them in the area, no movement inside the apartment, and no indication of where they had gone. Officers expanded the search, canvassed nearby units, and began contacting relatives. The priority was locating Nigel and baby Honora, and determining whether they were safe. The concern grew heavier by the minute. Then a neighbor shared crucial information. Earlier in the day, they had heard what sounded like an argument near the home, followed by several sharp, distinct sounds they couldn't identify at the time. Another neighbor had seen Ross leaving with the children under circumstances that didn't seem normal. These accounts gave police the first working direction. Ross was alive, armed, and moving with both children. Law enforcement agencies across the area were alerted. Officers searched surrounding streets and apartment complexes, checking parking lots and nearby roads. Hours passed with no sign of Ross or the children, until a break came from a resident who reported seeing a man matching Ross's description near another area of the complex earlier in the day. Officers returned to the scene and began a more detailed sweep. As they reached a nearby unit, they spotted movement from inside and realized they had located Ross. The situation escalated quickly. Officers saw that Ross was armed and refused to come out. They ordered him to surrender, but he stepped back into the apartment and closed the door. The children were nowhere in sight. Negotiators were called in as the standoff began. Police could not determine what condition the children were in or whether they were still alive. The uncertainty added urgency to every decision. The standoff stretched for hours. Negotiators attempted to reach Ross repeatedly, trying to establish communication and get him to come out safely. They called his phone, spoke through loudspeakers, and attempted to calm the situation. Christmas night settled across the city while officers remained in position, surrounding the building and preparing for all possible outcomes. Tension rose each time Ross appeared near a window. Each movement left officers guessing whether he intended to surrender, flee, or escalate the situation further. As the evening progressed, police were able to retrieve additional evidence from the surrounding area. Shell casings were found near Iris's body. Officers located a trail of footprints that ended near the apartment where Ross was hiding. Everything pointed to a violent confrontation that had unfolded with shocking speed earlier that day. Detectives worked on reconstructing the timeline, piecing together the hours between Iris's last message and the moment police first arrived. Witness statements helped fill in some of the gaps, but the most important questions remained unanswered. Where were Nigel and Honora? And were they still alive? Inside the police command post, the tone shifted from uncertainty to growing dread. Officers had already determined that Iris had died from her injuries. The likelihood that Ross had also harmed the children became a leading concern. Every minute that passed made the possibility more real. But without visual confirmation, officers could not make assumptions. They continued efforts to negotiate, hoping Ross might surrender and give investigators access to the apartment before the situation became more dangerous. Shortly before nightfall, the standoff reached a turning point. Ross briefly stepped outside, raising his hands, then quickly retreated back inside. Officers interpreted it as a potential attempt to provoke a response or stall for time. Negotiators continued speaking to him, urging cooperation. The goal was to end the situation without further violence. But the delay made it clear Ross was not ready to surrender. As the hours dragged on, tactical units prepared for the possibility that force might become necessary. The priority remained the children. Officers hoped they were still alive somewhere inside, or that Ross had left them with someone else before returning. Investigators reviewed every lead from neighbors, every reported sighting, every detail they could confirm. Yet nothing pointed to the children being anywhere but with Ross at some point earlier that day. The calm of Christmas night stood in sharp contrast to the growing fear surrounding that apartment complex. Residents remained indoors. Police lights filled the parking lot with flashing color. The situation had started with a concerned friend trying to check on Iris. Now it had grown into an hours-long effort involving patrol officers, detectives, tactical teams, and crisis negotiators, all hoping to prevent the worst outcome. Night settled over the apartment complex as officers maintained their positions around the building. The temperatures dropped, lights flashed across the parking lot, and the quiet of Christmas night carried an unusual tension. From the outside, the apartment looked still, but officers knew Ross was inside. They could hear movement now and then, the faint sound of footsteps and occasional noises that suggested he was pacing. Every shift of sound mattered. It gave negotiators something to interpret, something to build on. Crisis negotiators continued reaching out. They called his phone repeatedly, trying to get him talking long enough to understand his state of mind. Each time, the effort met silence. He would pick up, then hang up. At other moments, he refused entirely. It created a cycle of uncertainty that prevented officers from safely entering. Negotiators asked simple questions, urged him to come outside unarmed, and reminded him that no one had been hurt since police arrived. But nothing suggested he was ready to comply. Detectives continued piecing together information from the hours before police found him. They interviewed neighbors who had seen Ross earlier that day. A few recalled seeing him walking quickly through the complex. Another resident described a moment when Ross appeared unsettled, moving back and forth near a stairwell while talking to himself. These details offered insight into his behavior, but still provided no confirmation about the children's location. Detectives checked surveillance systems from nearby buildings and parking lots, hoping a camera captured Ross leaving or entering a different unit. Most cameras were outdated or pointed at angles that offered little help. The lack of clear footage left investigators relying mostly on witness accounts. Inside the command post, officers mapped every step Ross could have taken. They marked off possible hiding spots, dumpsters, storage areas, and stairwells. Infrared scans were conducted in the surrounding area, but no heat signatures matching the children were detected. Officers expanded the perimeter beyond the complex, checking alleys, nearby streets, and open fields. They walked the routes Ross could have taken on foot and checked every corner where a child might have been left. Nothing stood out. Back near the apartment, tactical officers remained stationed behind cover. Their goal was to contain Ross and prevent him from escaping into the neighborhood while negotiators tried to maintain communication. The possibility of him fleeing or acting unpredictably weighed heavily on the teams. They needed to stay patient, but they also knew that patience alone wouldn't guarantee a safe ending. Each passing minute added pressure. Negotiators attempted different approaches. They offered him food and water. They emphasized that they wanted to resolve the situation peacefully. They encouraged him to talk about the children, hoping that mentioning them might prompt him to give information. Ross stayed quiet. At moments he approached a window, looking out briefly before moving away again. Each appearance was monitored carefully, and officers anticipated the possibility he might suddenly step out armed. Meanwhile, detectives continued working through Iris's last known communications. Her unanswered messages painted a picture of a routine meeting that had turned into something far more serious. The timeline suggested she had gone to the apartment earlier in the day, with no sign she expected danger. Investigators collected her phone for analysis and reviewed calls and texts. They contacted friends, relatives, and anyone who might know whether Ross had expressed distress or anger in recent days. Several acquaintances mentioned long-standing tension between the couple, including arguments over finances and ongoing disagreements during the separation. These accounts helped detectives understand the emotional backdrop, but they still lacked the critical information about the children. As the night grew colder, a police drone was sent above the complex to monitor movement around the area. Its camera fed live video to officers on the ground, but Ross stayed inside, out of sight for long intervals. Officers noted shifts in the apartment's interior lights, small changes that indicated he was moving from room to room. None of these movements revealed anything about the children. Negotiators made another attempt to call him, using a calmer, slower approach. They focused on reassuring him that ending the standoff peacefully would allow everyone to work through the situation without further harm. The call went unanswered again. Detectives returned to the initial scene where Iris had been found. They examined the area more thoroughly with forensic teams. They photographed the surroundings, collected DNA samples, and documented evidence that would later help reconstruct the events of the day. The condition of the scene suggested a sudden confrontation, and investigators believed the attack had happened quickly. This led them to search the path Ross likely took after leaving the area, documenting anything he might have dropped or discarded. Officers found footprints matching the earlier discovery that moved toward the complex. These tracks reinforced the belief he had returned to the apartment after the confrontation. As the standoff stretched on, tactical commanders discussed the possibility of using gas or breaching devices if negotiations continued to fail. Every option was considered in terms of risk, especially with the chance the children could be inside. The hope was to avoid forcing an entry unless absolutely necessary. But with no communication from Ross and no sign of the children, the situation remained unpredictable. Around this time, a resident approached officers with new information. They recalled hearing what sounded like a muffled cry earlier in the day, before the police arrived. At the time, they thought it was a child playing or a nearby family. The timing and direction of the sound suggested it could have come from the apartment Ross entered. Although the detail couldn't confirm anything, detectives factored it into their timeline. It indicated that the children might have been present earlier, but still didn't reveal their current condition. Inside the command post, everyone shared a growing concern. Without direct communication from Ross, the situation reached a point where assumptions had to be made carefully. The primary concern remained the safety of the children. Officers believed Ross might still be armed, and he had already refused multiple opportunities to surrender. The longer the standoff lasted, the more unpredictable the outcome became. Negotiators made another attempt to speak with him. This time, they tried using a different tone. They spoke slowly, emphasizing that he had a chance to make choices that could help everyone, including himself. They asked him to show his hands at the window, or say a single word to confirm the children were safe. No response came. It was another setback that tightened the pressure on the officers outside. With each hour, the standoff became more unstable. Tactical teams remained prepared, knowing the situation could change at any moment. They monitored the apartment's door, windows, and any movement inside. The atmosphere surrounding the building felt heavier as the night deepened. Officers tried to keep communication open, even without responses, hoping that a small shift might persuade Ross to surrender. Despite the silence from inside, negotiators continued their efforts without pause. They repeated the same calm messages, knowing that repetition sometimes helped break through in high-stress situations. Their goal was to keep him engaged, even if he wasn't answering. They wanted to prevent him from feeling isolated or cornered. Every moment of contact, even indirect, was a step toward resolution. By this point, the standoff had grown into one of the most tense situations local officers had handled in recent years. The concern for the children, the lack of communication, and the gravity of what had already taken place all weighed heavily on the teams surrounding the apartment. The night continued without a clear sign of movement inside, but officers stayed ready for the moment when everything would shift. The standoff had stretched deep into the night, and officers remained positioned throughout the apartment complex. Floodlights illuminated the building, and negotiators continued their efforts without stepping away. Hours of silence were broken only by the soft hum of police radios and the occasional movement inside the unit where Ross had barricaded himself. Tension had settled into every corner of the scene, and officers understood that the situation could shift without warning. Shortly after midnight, negotiators made one more attempt to connect. They called his phone again and used the loudspeaker to ask him to step outside with empty hands. For several minutes, there was no response. Then officers noticed slight movement through the blinds. A few moments later, the door opened. Ross stepped out slowly, his hands raised. He looked around, made eye contact with officers, and walked forward without speaking. Tactical teams approached and took him into custody with a controlled arrest. The moment passed quickly, but the silence that followed made it clear that the most difficult part of the night was still ahead. With Ross detained, officers entered the apartment to secure the scene. What they found brought the long hours of uncertainty to an end. Nigel and baby Honora were discovered inside, and both had been killed earlier in the day. The discovery confirmed the worst fear investigators had carried throughout the standoff. For the officers who had spent the night hoping for another outcome, the scene left an immediate and lasting weight. Detectives took over the apartment and began carefully documenting every detail. They collected shell casings, photographed the rooms, and noted the position of each item. The evidence indicated the killings had taken place before officers arrived for the welfare check. The timeline became clearer. Investigators determined that Ross had attacked Iris first, then returned to the apartment, where he killed both children. Forensic teams worked through the night, while detectives reconstructed the sequence of events with each piece of evidence they uncovered. Once Ross was transported to the station, questioning began. He remained calm and offered minimal explanation. His responses revealed little emotion, and detectives noted his lack of urgency when addressing what had happened. In the hours that followed, the details of the case grew clearer through interviews, collected evidence, and timelines pieced together from witness accounts. What emerged was a picture of a strained relationship marked by arguments, financial pressure, and attempts by Iris to distance herself and secure independence for herself and the children. In the days following the murders, the community in Phoenix expressed shock and grief. Neighbors who had seen the children playing days earlier struggled to accept the news. Friends of Iris described her as devoted to rebuilding stability for her family and determined to create a safer future. Vigils were held, candles placed outside the apartment complex, and messages were left for the three victims. The tragedy stood out not only because it occurred on Christmas Day, but because it involved a family that had been quietly trying to move forward. As investigators continued their work, prosecutors reviewed the evidence. The case presented a clear pattern of control and escalating conflict. Witnesses described arguments in the months leading up to the separation. Financial strain placed additional pressure on the relationship. Friends of Iris shared messages in which she expressed frustration and fear about Ross's behavior. These accounts became part of the prosecution's framework as they prepared for trial. When the case was presented in court, prosecutors emphasized that the killings had stemmed from Ross's desire to maintain control. They argued that the separation threatened his sense of authority and left him feeling unable to dictate the direction of the family. They pointed to financial dependence and ongoing domestic conflict as contributing factors. The timeline showed deliberate actions taken throughout the day, leading from one location to another with clear intent. Evidence from the apartment and witness statements supported the conclusion that the killings were carried out in succession, not in panic. Throughout the trial, Iris's friends and relatives attended regularly, often filling the courtroom's front rows. Their presence served as a reminder of the lasting impact the murders had left behind. They listened as detectives described the crime scenes, as prosecutors outlined the timeline, and as experts testified about the sequence and nature of the injuries. The courtroom atmosphere remained quiet, marked by a solemn attention to detail. Ross maintained a calm demeanor throughout the proceedings. When questioned, he gave short answers and avoided lengthy explanations. At one point, he acknowledged responsibility for the deaths, though he did so without offering insight into his motivations. His admission confirmed key elements of the case, but left many questions unanswered. For the jury, the combination of physical evidence, witness accounts, and his own statements formed a clear foundation. The verdict reflected the severity of the crimes. Ross was convicted on multiple counts, including first-degree murder. The court addressed each victim individually, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the killings. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors highlighted the themes that had shaped their case from the beginning: control, financial dependence, and conflict within the home. They argued that these dynamics created an environment where Ross viewed violence as a means of reclaiming authority. The judge acknowledged the weight of the evidence, the loss suffered by the family, and the impact on the community. Ross received a sentence that ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The court's decision brought the legal process to a close, though the emotional aftermath remained for everyone who knew the victims. Iris's friends remembered her as resilient and caring. They spoke about her efforts to create stability for her children and her determination to move forward despite the challenges she faced. For many, the loss of Nigel and baby Honora represented a tragedy that extended far beyond the courtroom. In the months that followed, the case became a reference point in discussions about domestic violence and the quiet escalation that can occur inside relationships. Advocates emphasized the importance of recognizing early warning signs and providing support for people trying to leave difficult situations. Officers who worked the case described it as one of the most painful they had encountered, not only because it involved children, but because it unfolded on a day when families typically gather in peace. The apartment complex eventually returned to normal routines, though residents remembered the night when police lights filled the parking lot and officers stood guard outside a single unit for hours. The holiday season in that neighborhood carried a different feeling afterward. For the family and friends of the victims, the shock of a loss became a long-term reality. The case of the Christmas Day family murders remained a stark reminder of how quickly domestic conflict can escalate behind closed doors. It underscored the fragile lines between public image and private turmoil, and how control, resentment, and fear can converge with tragic results. Investigators, prosecutors, and community members carried the memory of the victims long after the trial ended, recognizing the lasting impact of a crime that unfolded quietly on a day meant for celebration. On Christmas Eve 2008, a quiet Covina neighborhood became the scene of one of California's most disturbing crimes. A family gathered for a holiday celebration never saw the danger approaching. A man dressed as Santa arrived at their door, and within minutes, the night turned into shocking tragedy. On Christmas Eve 2008, the Ortega family home in Covina was bright with the kind of noise and warmth that usually comes with a long-standing holiday tradition. Relatives gathered in the living room, sharing food, small gifts, and the simple comfort of being together. For years, this was the one night everyone tried to attend. It was the holiday anchor for a large and close family, and the people inside had every reason to believe this year would be no different. From the street, nothing suggested danger. The house looked like any other in the neighborhood, lit with string lights, with cars lining the curb. No one inside imagined a threat was making its way toward their door. The man arriving was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, 45 years old, quiet by nature, and recently divorced from one of the women inside the house. What most of the family didn't know was how deeply he'd been unraveling in the months leading up to that night. His marriage had ended bitterly, his financial situation was collapsing, and he had lost the future he believed he was entitled to. What looked like a sudden attack had roots that stretched back much further, into disappointments that he refused to accept and a growing belief that he had been wronged. In his mind, someone needed to pay for it. In the days before Christmas, Pardo was alone and angry, drifting further from anything resembling normal life. Friends would later describe him as withdrawn and resentful, a man carrying a silent list of grievances. He had once appeared steady, even reliable, but that version of himself was gone. In its place was someone who believed destruction would even the score. To carry out what he was planning, he adopted a disguise that would guarantee people opened the door without hesitation. He put on a Santa Claus suit, not as a joke or a festive gesture, but as a calculated method of getting close to the people he blamed for everything he had lost. That night, while the Ortega family celebrated, he walked toward the house with a large, wrapped box and a mask covering part of his face. His arrival didn't raise suspicion at first. A man dressed as Santa on Christmas Eve hardly seemed out of place, and a knock on the door during a gathering usually meant another relative had arrived late. But inside that box were weapons and homemade materials meant for far more than intimidation. The suit, the mask, the wrapping paper. Every detail had been chosen to lower defenses long enough for him to strike. Behind the cheerful disguise was a man who had been stewing in resentment over his divorce from Sylvia Ortega, who was inside the house with her family. Their marriage had lasted only a short time, collapsing under financial arguments, disagreements about responsibility, and Pardo's reluctance to support her children. When the relationship ended, he did not simply move on. Instead, he replayed every argument and grievance, convincing himself that Sylvia and her family had humiliated him, bankrupted him, and ruined his life. He treated the divorce not as a painful separation, but as a personal betrayal. The court proceedings only deepened that anger. When he was ordered to pay support, he felt it was an attack on his dignity. When the payments were enforced, he saw it as a deliberate attempt to crush him. In reality, he had the means to meet his obligations for a time, but his bitterness overshadowed reason. Instead of adapting to the new reality, he piled resentment on top of frustration, letting it grow unchecked. By late 2008, his financial issues had escalated, and he was facing the consequences of choices he didn't want to acknowledge. He was starting to see retaliation as the only way to reclaim a sense of control. As the holiday approached, the Ortega family had no reason to expect trouble. The divorce had been unpleasant, but they believed distance had settled things. They were unaware that Pardo had been watching their routines, analyzing the layout of the house where the party took place, and rehearsing how he would enter. The family was focused on the holiday. The last thing on their minds was the possibility that someone would use that gathering as the stage for a violent plan. Inside the home, children were opening small presents while adults talked around the kitchen island. Music played softly in the background. The conversations were ordinary and familiar, the kind that only happen among people who know each other well. No one paused to think that an unexpected knock might signal anything more than a late-arriving guest. That sense of ease was exactly what Pardo relied on. He had always presented himself as someone who avoided conflict. To Sylvia's relatives, he had seemed distant but not threatening. Most still saw him as the man who once showed up politely at their gatherings, offering quiet greetings and keeping to himself. That mild image made what happened next all the more shocking. They had no real insight into how deeply his sense of failure was eating at him, or how committed he was to a plan shaped entirely by anger. Pardo's decision to dress as Santa was more than a disguise. It was a twisted manipulation of a simple family's associate with joy and generosity. Using that image allowed him to move through the neighborhood without attracting attention. It gave him plausible reason to carry the large package he brought with him. It also ensured that anyone opening the door would be caught off guard. He counted on that moment of surprise, knowing the costume would lower defenses long enough for him to take control. The days leading up to the attack were marked by careful preparation on his part. He didn't improvise. He purchased items gradually, keeping a low profile, avoiding anything that could draw suspicion. He rehearsed what he would do and how quickly he needed to move. Everything about the plan was designed for shock and speed. He wasn't interested in confrontation or negotiation. His motive was rooted in a desire to inflict maximum harm on the people he believed had taken his life apart piece by piece. As he approached the Ortega home on that quiet Covina street, the contrast between what the family expected and what he intended could not have been sharper. Inside was celebration. Outside was a man convinced that this night belonged to him, and that the culmination of his anger would unfold behind that front door. What happened next would shatter a family, stun a community, and turn a holiday evening into one of the most devastating crimes in California's recent history. The Ortega home grew louder as the evening went on. More relatives arrived, the kitchen filled with conversation, and the children wandered between rooms, showing each other their small gifts. It was a comfortable scene, the sort of gathering that settles into its own rhythm without anyone needing to organize it. People were relaxed, talking over each other, refilling drinks, and drifting between the living room and the dining area. No one noticed the sound of footsteps approaching the porch outside. A knock came at the door. It wasn't forceful or rushed, just a quick tap that blended in with the background noise. One of the younger family members stepped away from the couch to answer it, expecting another cousin or neighbor. When the door swung open, the sight of a man in a Santa suit didn't alarm anybody. It even drew a few smiles. A child ran closer, thinking it was part of the holiday fun. For a split second, everyone inside assumed this was a playful surprise arranged by someone in the family. That moment of ease vanished the instant the man raised his arm. Before anyone could register what was happening, he fired into the doorway. The entrance became a flash of noise and chaos as people scrambled for cover. The music cut off, drowned out by screams and the sudden rush of movement. The attack was quick and targeted. He wasn't pausing or looking for recognition. He was carrying out a plan he had rehearsed in his head over and over. Inside the crowded living room, confusion turned instantly to panic. Some dropped to the floor without understanding where the shots came from. Others tried to shield children or pull relatives toward any corner that looked like protection. A holiday gathering that had been warm and familiar only minutes earlier was transformed into a scene filled with smoke, overturned chairs, and desperate attempts to escape the line of fire. Pardo stepped farther into the house, still wearing the Santa suit, still holding the wrapped box that disguised the tools he brought with him. The costume, once a symbol of harmlessness, now made the entire scene feel unreal, as if the violence happening in front of them couldn't possibly be tied to something so familiar. But the attack was deliberate. he moved with direction, heading toward areas where he knew the family gathered each year. Some relatives tried to reach the back of the house, hoping to get outside through a side door or make their way into the yard. Others huddled behind furniture, unsure whether he was alone or if something worse was coming. The house, usually cramped only during the busiest holidays, now felt like a trap. In every direction there were obstacles, walls, or corners that made it hard to see what was happening. People tried to guide children away from the center of the room, speaking in rushed whispers, trying to stay quiet and hidden. Pardo opened the box he had brought and took out another device he had prepared in advance. He wasn't relying solely on the initial attack. He wanted destruction that would spread quickly. As he moved through the house, the smell of gasoline began to seep into the air. Some relatives recognized it immediately and tried to shout warnings, but the panic was already overwhelming the room. The realization that the assault was escalating sparked a new rush toward the exits. In the confusion, people stumbled, collided, and clung to each other, trying to find a path out. The layout of the home, usually so familiar, became disorienting. Visibility was limited, not only by the smoke beginning to fill the space, but by the sheer panic that clouded judgment. Even those who knew the house well found themselves struggling to navigate rooms they had walked through countless times. A few managed to escape through broken windows or back doors that had been forced open. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, stepped outside and saw people emerging from the home in shock, some injured, others crying for help. The neighborhood, quiet only minutes earlier, was suddenly alive with shouts and frantic movement. It didn't take long for someone to call 911, though the full extent of what was happening inside wasn't immediately clear to the operators receiving the calls. Back inside, flames were beginning to spread. The accelerant Pardo had brought ignited faster than anyone could react. Curtains caught, then walls, then the ceiling. Smoke thickened, making it harder to breathe or see. The fire grew at an alarming rate, feeding on the materials placed inside the home for the party. Pardo's goal wasn't just harm. It was devastation. The heat intensified, pushing those still inside to make desperate attempts to escape. Outside, neighbors tried to help survivors out of the yard and onto the sidewalk. Some attempted to approach the house, but the heat and smoke forced them back. The glow inside the windows grew brighter as flames climbed the walls. People who had made it out stood in shock, struggling to explain what had happened. The idea that someone dressed as Santa had entered a Christmas Eve party with violent intent was almost too surreal to process. First responders arrived to a scene that was already difficult to control. The home was fully engulfed, with flames breaking through the roof and pouring out of broken windows. Firefighters moved quickly to contain the blaze and to search for anyone who might still be inside, though the intensity of the fire made the interior nearly impossible to access at first. Police officers worked to gather survivors, separate witnesses, and secure the area around the home. Many of the people outside were in shock, some too injured to speak clearly, others unable to explain what they had just witnessed. As the fire spread beyond the first floor, responders realized this wasn't a typical house fire caused by an accident or electrical issue. The speed of the flames, the reports from survivors, and the early witness descriptions pointed to something far worse. Law enforcement began treating the scene as a major crime incident. Officers took statements from anyone able to speak, trying to understand who the attacker was and why he had chosen this night. Survivors who recognized Pardo didn't initially believe he was capable of something like this, even though the shock of seeing him in the doorway had been unmistakable. As they recounted details, the connection between the attacker and the family became clearer. The pieces started forming a picture that pointed to a violent act driven by personal motive, not randomness. Firefighters continued battling the blaze, working to prevent it from spreading to nearby homes. Thick smoke blanketed the street, leaving the neighborhood unrecognizable. Christmas lights on nearby houses flickered through the haze. The air was filled with the sounds of emergency radios, rushing water, and the muffled cries of people trying to make sense of what had happened. As the response expanded, investigators began piecing together the early facts. They learned that the attacker had come dressed as Santa, that he brought weapons and incendiary materials, and that he had targeted a family gathering he knew took place every year. The level of planning was obvious, and the motive was becoming clearer by the minute. The flames burned long into the night, leaving behind a structure barely standing. The celebration that had filled the home only hours earlier was gone, replaced by a scene of destruction that stunned even seasoned responders. What started as a family holiday gathering had turned into one of the most shocking events the city had ever seen. By the early hours of Christmas morning, the fire at the Ortega home had been reduced to a smoldering frame. Crews worked through the ash and debris, searching methodically for evidence, while investigators met with surviving relatives and witnesses in a nearby command post. The scale of the destruction made it clear that this wasn't an impulsive act. It had been carried out with preparation and purpose, leaving behind a scene that required careful reconstruction piece by piece. Detectives focused first on identifying the attacker. Witness accounts were remarkably consistent. Those who had escaped the home all repeated the same detail. The man in the Santa suit was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. As officers ran his information, his name connected immediately to the family through his marriage to Sylvia Ortega. What had been a chaotic and confusing emergency now took on a clearer shape. This wasn't an attack driven by chance. It was personal. Law enforcement began assembling a timeline, starting with Pardo's recent behavior. They learned about his financial decline, the loss of his job, and his growing resentment over the divorce settlement. Former co-workers described him as withdrawn in the months before the attack, keeping conversations short and showing signs of frustration he didn't fully explain. Friends said he had become increasingly bitter, circling around complaints about his former marriage and the obligations he believed were unfair. Detectives also uncovered purchases he had made in the weeks leading up to the attack. He had rented equipment, bought materials used in the fire, and obtained a custom Santa suit. None of these actions were spontaneous. Each purchase pointed to someone shaping a plan long before the holiday arrived. Investigators noted that he had created layers of deception, from the costume to the wrapped box, ensuring he could get close to the family without raising suspicion. As the scene at the Ortega home continued to be processed, another call came into law enforcement from a different part of Southern California. A vehicle had been found parked on a quiet street in Sylmar, and the license plate matched Pardo's. Officers approached carefully, unsure whether he might still be inside. When they checked the vehicle, they discovered several items associated with the earlier attack. The presence of additional materials raised the disturbing possibility that he had planned a further act or escape route. Not long after, a second report reached police. This one came from the home of Pardo's brother, where a body had been discovered. The description matched Pardo. Detectives quickly headed to the location, and the confirmation came shortly after. Pardo had died by suicide. The cause pointed to an intentional action, carried out shortly after he fled the scene in Covina. The discovery shifted the course of the investigation. Instead of preparing for a pursuit or potential additional violence, detectives now concentrated on reconstructing Pardo's final movements. They pieced together his drive from Covina to Sylmar, his attempt to distance himself from the burning home, and the end of his plan inside his brother's residence. They also evaluated the injuries on his body. Burns suggested that part of his own plan had backfired. Whatever control he thought he had over the attack had not gone exactly as he intended. While investigators worked, surviving relatives met with police to share what they remembered. Their accounts were heartbreaking, but vital. They described where they were standing, where the attacker entered, and how quickly the violence spread. Detectives used those descriptions to map the interior of the home as it had been before the fire. Even though the structure was heavily damaged, the reconstruction helped clarify how the events unfolded inside. As the hours turned into days, the full picture of the attack came into focus. The motive was rooted in resentment over the divorce, a failing financial situation, and a belief that his former family was responsible for his downfall. Investigators concluded that the attack had been planned specifically for Christmas Eve because he knew the Ortega family always gathered in the same place on that night. The timing wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Experts brought into the case agreed that the level of preparation was unusually detailed. Pardo had assembled incendiary devices, carried out surveillance, and disguised his intentions with a costume designed to lower defenses. He had no history of violent offenses, no record suggesting he would escalate to this level, which made the attack feel even more shocking to those who had known him casually. But the investigation left no doubt that he had moved through each step with the intention of causing maximum harm. Once the immediate investigative work at both scenes was complete, authorities turned to the larger task of addressing the community's reaction. Covina had never experienced a crime of this scale. The suddenness of the attack, combined with its timing on a holiday, left residents shaken. Vigils began appearing on the sidewalks near the Ortega home. People placed candles, flowers, and handwritten messages at the site, trying to make sense of the enormity of what had happened. Law enforcement held a briefing to summarize the known information, making it clear that the attacker was deceased and there was no continuing threat to the public. They confirmed his identity, the evidence linking him to the crime, and the primary motive emerging from the investigation. Officials explained that the attack stemmed from personal motives rather than a random act of violence, a small piece of clarity in an otherwise devastating situation. Fire investigators released their findings as well. They determined that the blaze had been accelerated by the materials Pardo brought into the home, causing a rapid spread that overwhelmed the interior. The fire's speed made rescue efforts nearly impossible once it fully ignited. Their report underscored how calculated the attack had been. It wasn't only about targeting individuals, but about ensuring destruction. In the weeks that followed, the community leaned heavily on one another. Local organizations offered support services, and counselors worked with survivors and relatives as they processed the trauma. The Ortega family received an outpouring of support from people across California and beyond, many of whom had never met them but were moved by the tragedy. The story resonated widely, in part because it shattered the sense of safety often associated with holiday gatherings. As the case reached its final stages, investigators compiled their findings into a comprehensive report. It detailed the planning, the execution, and the aftermath of the attack. It concluded that Pardo had acted alone and that his motivation was anchored in anger and personal failure. There was no evidence of outside involvement. The report also confirmed that he had taken his own life shortly after fleeing, ending the possibility of prosecution. Because of his death, there was no trial, no confession, and no formal sentencing. The investigative findings served as the only complete record of the case, offering answers where the legal system could not proceed further. Authorities closed the case with the conclusion that the attacker was solely responsible for the events of that night, and that his actions were driven by resentment tied to his divorce, financial decline, and unresolved personal grievances. The story of the Covina Christmas Eve massacre left a lasting mark on the community and on those who followed the case. It served as a stark reminder of the damage that can arise when anger goes unchecked and plans built on bitterness escalate into violence. In the end, the tragedy stood not only as a loss for one family, but as a moment that deeply affected everyone who lived in the quiet neighborhood where the night began. A quiet Christmas morning in Grapevine turned into one of Texas's most haunting tragedies. A man dressed as Santa walked into a family gathering, carrying the weight of a broken marriage and collapsing finances. Within minutes, celebration became catastrophe, leaving investigators stunned and a community forever changed. Grapevine was quiet that Christmas morning. The streets were still, the winter air was sharp, and most people stayed indoors with their families. Inside one of the apartment units, relatives had gathered to celebrate the holiday in a low-key way. There were small gifts, a simple meal planned, and the comfort of spending time together before the new year. It was meant to be a day of normalcy, even though the family had been through months of separation, tension, and stress. Aziz Yazdanpana had once been part of that home. His marriage had unraveled, finances had become unstable, and the life he had tried to control was slipping away. Although he and his wife were living apart, they still shared the responsibility of raising their children, and holidays were sensitive. The family expected things to stay peaceful, or at least manageable, despite the strain. That morning, Aziz arrived wearing a Santa costume. It seemed like a strange choice for someone in the middle of separation, but no one reacted with suspicion. To them, it looked like a clumsy attempt to be festive, maybe even an effort to avoid awkwardness. What they didn't realize was that the costume served a darker purpose. It concealed him and softened his arrival, lowering their guard at the exact moment he needed it. Aziz had been struggling long before that day. He had bounced between temporary living spaces, never settling into a stable routine. Friends described him as restless and tense, someone who didn't speak openly about what he was feeling, but showed signs of frustration through silence and withdrawal. His separation had been painful, and the process of dividing responsibilities, finances, and custody had only intensified what he already saw as personal failure. Inside the apartment, the holiday looked ordinary. Someone had brewed a pot of coffee. The television played in the background, tuned to a holiday movie. A few gifts had been unwrapped. Pieces of torn wrapping paper lay on the floor, and the children were focused on small presents that kept them distracted. The kitchen held the lingering smell of breakfast, and conversations moved in and out of the room with the ease only family gatherings have. There was no sense of danger. No one seemed worried that Aziz was standing among them, still dressed as Santa. The problems between Aziz and his wife had escalated throughout the year. They disagreed over money, over expectations, and over how to manage the changes brought on by separation. He worried about losing his influence in his children's lives, and he often expressed a fear that his role as a father was slipping away. That fear grew into resentment. He refused multiple opportunities to seek counseling, brushing off advice from those who encouraged him to find help. The more isolated he became, the more his frustration deepened. Still, no one in that apartment knew the extent of what he had been planning. In the weeks before Christmas, Aziz kept to himself almost completely. He avoided gatherings, postponed conversations, and rarely allowed anyone to understand what was going through his mind. People who interacted with him said he looked drained, distracted, and weighed down by something he wouldn't put into words. These warning signs never reached the family he would later target. His arrival on Christmas morning didn't immediately disrupt the warm atmosphere. The relatives treated it as a surprising but harmless moment, something to shrug off as they tried to keep the holiday peaceful. There were greetings, nods, and a brief attempt to make space for him. The children glanced up from their gifts, confused but not alarmed. The adults continued their conversations, unaware that the situation around them had already changed. Aziz stood quietly among them. Neighbors later recalled hearing soft laughter earlier in the morning, the kind of muffled sound that blends into a still winter day. Nothing about what they heard suggested conflict. There were no raised voices, no signs of panic, nothing that hinted at the violence that was building beneath the surface. The Santa costume covered Aziz's expression, and the silence disguised his intentions. His long-standing habit of appearing calm, even in stressful moments, worked against the family that day. He didn't show anger. He didn't argue. He didn't create tension. He simply moved around the space with the same controlled manner he had carried through the later stages of his marriage. Those who had observed him in recent months said he often tried to suppress visible emotion, maintaining a surface-level calm that made it hard to tell when something was wrong. Inside that apartment, the habit served its purpose. No one recognized the shift in his demeanor or the gravity of the choice he had already made. The lead-up to the violence wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the final result of a slow decline. He had spoken to a few people in the past about feeling cornered, abandoned, and unable to recover from what he had lost. He worried about financial instability and believed life had moved on without him. Instead of adapting or seeking help, he retreated further into himself until the pressure became something he could no longer manage. The relatives in the apartment continued their mourning without realizing the danger standing in the same room. His wife moved from the kitchen to the living room. The children kept themselves busy with toys and conversations. Others discussed their plans for the afternoon. There was no hint of anything unusual, no sign that they were moments away from a life-ending tragedy. They trusted the quiet of the morning. They trusted the familiar face in a Santa suit. They had no reason to brace themselves for what was approaching. The combination of marital breakdown, financial stress, emotional isolation, and resentment had brought Aziz to a point where he no longer saw a way forward. The holiday gathering offered him access, familiarity, and a setting where no one expected hostility. It was a place where people were relaxed, unprotected, and focused on the comfort of the day. Observers later noted how unnerving it was that everything appeared normal right before the attack, and how the calmness of the scene stood in stark contrast to what followed. But the tragedy didn't begin with action. It began with the quiet in that apartment, the small talk, the smell of food, and the illusion that the morning was like any other Christmas. Aziz, concealed behind a Santa costume, stood inside a home he no longer considered his own. He didn't speak openly about what he was thinking. He didn't reveal what he was there to do. No one sensed the shift that had already taken hold. The final moments before the violence looked ordinary. The family believed they were safe among people they loved. They didn't know that the man in front of them had already crossed a line in his mind, and that the peaceful morning would soon turn into one of the most devastating holiday tragedies the city had ever faced. The quiet inside the apartment didn't last. Aziz had come in wearing a Santa costume, blending into a moment where no one questioned his presence. But underneath the costume, he had already made his decision. The hours of separation, the financial pressure, and the sense of losing control had weighed on him until the holiday morning became the point where everything collapsed. At first, nothing felt wrong. The family moved through the living room, stepping around wrapping paper, refilling coffee cups, and settling into small conversations. The atmosphere was still calm enough for anyone walking in from the outside to mistake it for an ordinary Christmas gathering. But Aziz wasn't participating. He stayed near the edges of the room, watching everyone else without joining anything they were doing. The shift began quietly. One relative later recalled that Aziz appeared unusually still, a detail that only made sense in hindsight. His movements were slow, deliberate, and out of place in a room full of people who were relaxed and unguarded. No one confronted him or asked questions. They were trying to keep the morning peaceful. Aziz's estranged wife moved around the room, focused on keeping the holiday routine steady. She had made an effort to give the children a calm Christmas, hoping the tension from the separation wouldn't overshadow the day. She didn't know that she was already at the center of the storm forming right behind her. The attack started without warning. There was no argument, no build-up, no shouting to signal what was about to unfold. Aziz acted suddenly, using the costume to hide the tools he brought with him. In seconds, the room went from stillness to chaos. His first targets were the people closest to him, the ones he felt had slipped away from his influence. The violence was quick and overwhelming, catching the family completely off guard. The relatives had no chance to understand what was happening, let alone react. Several were struck before they even turned in his direction. Witnesses who studied the crime scene later noted how the attack followed a pattern of movement, showing that Aziz wasn't acting impulsively, but following a sequence he had already decided on. He moved through the apartment as if each step had been mapped in advance. The children were nearby when the attack began. They tried to escape the sudden burst of violence, but the space inside the apartment was too small, and the shock hit them before their instincts could save them. Aziz had been part of their lives since birth, and in their eyes he was still a familiar figure, even if their parents' relationship had changed. That familiarity prevented them from recognizing danger until it was too late. The relatives attempted to shield each other, reacting out of instinct even as the situation became impossible to control. One tried to move toward the hallway to call for help, but the attack was too fast for anyone to reach safety. The noise inside the apartment rose sharply, sudden yells, breaking objects, and the sound of bodies collapsing. What had been a quiet living room moments earlier was now a scene of panic and fear. Even in the chaos, Aziz remained steady. Investigators later said his actions showed no hesitation, something that made the scene even more disturbing. He showed no signs of struggling with his decision, no moment where he reconsidered, no attempt to stop once the violence began. It was a complete break from the life he had known, and he committed himself to it without pause. The attack moved from room to room, leaving no space untouched. The kitchen chairs were knocked over. A table was overturned, and several household items were scattered across the floor, evidence of desperate attempts to escape or block his path. But the apartment was too small. There was nowhere to run, and no time to outmaneuver someone determined to wipe out his entire family. The sound inside the unit carried into the hallway, but neighbors didn't understand what they were hearing. Some thought it was part of a loud family dispute, something that occasionally happened in apartment complexes. Others assumed it was the noise of kids playing or furniture being moved. No one realized it was a massacre unfolding just beyond the walls. Within minutes, the apartment fell silent again. The violence had been swift and absolute. Everyone inside had been attacked, and the family that had gathered for a holiday morning was left lifeless inside the home where they had hoped to rebuild some sense of normalcy. Aziz stood alone in the aftermath. The Santa costume, which had made him appear harmless at the start of the morning, was now stained with the results of what he had done. The air inside the apartment was heavy and still, filled with the finality of what he had carried out. Investigators later described the scene as one of the most disturbing they had encountered, not only because of the violence, but because of the setting. Holiday decorations were still hanging. Gifts lay half opened, and the living room looked like a snapshot of a celebration frozen at the moment everything went wrong. It was the clash between the holiday warmth and the brutality of the attack that made the tragedy so haunting. Aziz didn't attempt to flee. He didn't run from the scene, try to hide what he had done, or reach out to anyone. He stayed in the apartment where the family had come together that morning, surrounded by the people whose lives had been intertwined with his for years. Forensic teams would later determine that Aziz spent only a short time alone after the attack, but long enough to take in the destruction he had caused. There was no sign that he attempted to call for help, no message left behind, and no explanation offered in any form. His final act was as abrupt and controlled as the rest of the attack. He took his own life inside the same apartment. The massacre had ended within minutes, leaving behind a crime scene that shocked not only Grapevine, but everyone who later learned the details. A family gathering meant to offer peace had instead become one of the most devastating holiday tragedies the region had ever faced. Outside, the world remained unaware for a short time. Cars passed by the complex. Neighbors carried on with their holiday plans, and children played in the nearby yards. Nothing outside the apartment hinted at the violence that had taken place just a few feet away. The bodies of the victims, still surrounded by traces of their Christmas morning, would soon be discovered by police responding to a call that no one expected on a day meant for family and celebration. The massacre was over, but the investigation, and the questions it raised, was just beginning. When the attack ended, the apartment fell into an eerie stillness. The violence had erupted and ended in minutes, but its impact would stretch far beyond that room. Aziz, still wearing the Santa costume he used as a disguise, remained inside the apartment where he had taken the lives of his estranged wife, his children, and several relatives. He then ended his own life, leaving the scene silent and untouched until police arrived. The first indication that something was wrong came from a phone call. A brief 911 call was made from inside the apartment, but no one spoke. The line stayed open long enough for the dispatcher to hear muffled noise, nothing clear enough to identify, but enough to send officers to check the home. On Christmas Day, those calls were rare. Police responded quickly. When officers reached the apartment, the door was locked. They knocked several times, calling out for anyone inside. There was no answer, no movement, and no explanation for the silent 911 call. Given the circumstances, they forced entry. What they found inside stopped them cold. The apartment was decorated for Christmas. Holiday lights still glowed in the living room. Gifts sat scattered near the tree. There were plates on the counter, wrapping paper on the floor, and the remains of a celebration that had barely begun. Among all of it were the bodies of 7 family members, each killed in the sudden burst of violence that Aziz had carried out. Aziz's body was also there, still in the Santa costume. He left no note, no explanation written on paper, and no recording. There was no apology or justification. The only answers would come from the investigation that followed. Police secured the scene immediately. Detectives and forensic teams were called in despite the holiday, arriving with a quiet focus they used in the most serious cases. They documented every corner of the apartment, marking the positions of the victims, the overturned furniture, and the costume Aziz had used. The details of the attack quickly became clear. It was deliberate. It was planned. And it had been carried out in a way that left no survivors inside the home. News of the massacre spread quickly through grapevine. Residents gathered outside the complex, trying to understand how such violence could erupt in a quiet community on Christmas morning. Some neighbors broke down in tears as they learned who the victims were, while others struggled with disbelief that a familiar family could meet such an end. The city, known for its calm and holiday traditions, found itself at the center of a tragedy that made national headlines. Investigators began piecing together what led to the attack. They interviewed relatives, friends, co-workers, and neighbors who had seen shifts in Aziz's behavior over the previous months. Several described him as increasingly withdrawn. Others said he appeared overwhelmed by financial troubles. And more than one person mentioned the emotional toll of the separation. The deeper investigators looked, the more the same themes emerged. Loss, pressure, isolation, anger simmering beneath the surface. They found no sign of mental health treatment and no attempt by Aziz to seek help in managing the downward spiral he was in. The victim's extended family arrived at the complex as soon as they heard the news. Officers kept them behind the police perimeter while the bodies were removed from the apartment. Some collapsed in grief. Others clung to each other in shock, unable to comprehend how a holiday gathering had ended in such devastation. Authorities arranged for counselors to meet with family members later that day, knowing the emotional impact would be long-lasting. As the investigation continued, police reviewed the available evidence. They examined phone records, financial documents, past reports, and personal messages, searching for anything that could shed light on Aziz's mindset. They found signs of financial instability, strained conversations about custody, and statements indicating he felt life was slipping beyond his control. These factors formed a picture of a man who had reached a breaking point he never expressed openly. Medical examiners completed their work, confirming that Aziz had taken his own life after killing the others. This conclusion shaped the final direction of the case. Since the killer was dead, there would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, and no sentencing. But the official findings still needed to be documented clearly. Police held a press conference after the results were finalized. They confirmed that Aziz had been solely responsible for the attack and that the motive centered on marital breakdown and financial stress, factors that had built pressure until he chose a violent, irreversible path. The chief described the attack as a planned family annihilation carried out under the cover of a Santa disguise. Reporters asked questions about warning signs, access to the apartment, and whether anything could have prevented the tragedy. The answers were limited. Much of what drove Aziz to act was internal, hidden, and unspoken. In the weeks that followed, Grapevine mourned the victims. Memorial services were held. Community members brought flowers to the apartment complex, and the families of the victims leaned on each other to process the enormity of their loss. The tragedy became one of the darkest moments in the city's history. The investigation remained open long enough for detectives to finalize every element. They completed the documentation, closed remaining questions, and wrote the final report. Since Aziz had ended his own life, there was no prosecution, no legal proceeding, and no sentencing. However, authorities still had to close the case officially. And that is where the final details appear. Confession. There was no confession from Aziz. He left no note, statement, or recording. The only evidence of his intent was the attack itself. Conviction. There was no conviction because Aziz died at the scene. However, the case file formally identifies him as the sole perpetrator responsible for the murders. Sentencing. There was no sentencing, as there was no trial. The final legal classification listed the incident as a murder-suicide, closing the case without the possibility of prosecution. Even with the file closed, the impact of the tragedy remained. Communities often move on after violent incidents, but families rarely do. For those who survived the victims, the loss shaped their lives in ways that cannot be measured, and every Christmas afterward carried a shadow of what happened in that small apartment. The Grapevine Santa family massacre became a chilling reminder of how quickly personal despair can turn into catastrophic violence. It was a case that combined the collapse of a marriage, financial stress, and an individual who saw no path forward. Wrapped in a Santa costume, the attack shocked both investigators and the public, not only because of its brutality, but because of its setting and timing. The holiday decorations, the gifts, and the disguise made the tragedy unforgettable. It was a crime that left a deep mark on the city, a family permanently shattered, and a community forced to confront the reality that even on a day meant for peace, danger can come from the person least expected.